Welcome to the Useless Hour. Tonight we are going to think about the music that nobody is listening to. Not unpopular music, not forgotten music. Music designed from the first note to be not listened to, and which succeeded so completely at this that most people who have spent their entire lives inside it could not hum a single bar. You know the sound, even if you have never once chosen to hear it. It is in the lift, in the 4 or 5 seconds between the doors closing and the doors opening. It is in the lobby of a mid-range hotel at 11 in the morning, when the lobby is empty and the music is playing anyway, to nobody, out of speakers set into a suspended ceiling. It is in the supermarket, above the chilled section. It is in the dentist's waiting room, where it is doing a very specific job that we will come to in some detail later. It is on the telephone when you are on hold. And here is the part that we are going to sit with for the next while. That sound was not an accident. It was not what happened when somebody with a radio left it on. It was a product. It was manufactured deliberately, to specification, by an actual corporation with an actual head office and actual research staff and actual patents, and it was sold on subscription to businesses in the same way a business might buy heating oil or a cleaning contract. Somebody at some point sat in a room and made decisions about the correct number of instruments and the correct tempo and the correct absence of a vocal line, and those decisions were then imposed on tens of thousands of ceilings across the industrialized world for decades. It is one of the very few cases in the history of the arts where boredom was the design brief rather than the failure. You do not need to remember any of this. But to get to the corporation, we have to go back a long way before there were any lifts worth putting music in, and we have to start not with a composer and not with a record company, but with a career officer of the United States Army. We will spend a good while on him. He is more interesting than the subject deserves, which is often the way.
His name was George Owen Squier. He was born on the 21st of March, 1865, in Dryden, Michigan, which is a small place in the eastern part of the state and remains one. He graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in the class of 1887, 7th in that class, and was commissioned a second lieutenant in the regular army that June. What happened next is the thing that makes him unusual. Rather than settling into the ordinary progression of a 19th century artillery officer, Squier went to Johns Hopkins University, studied physics, chemistry, and mathematics, and took a doctorate there in 1893. He is generally described as the first officer of the United States Army to hold a doctoral degree in the electrical sciences, and while you will see that claim phrased slightly differently in different places, the underlying point is not in dispute. He was a soldier who was also, and seriously, a physicist. Over his life, he was granted something in the region of 65 patents in wired and wireless communication. He was also the kind of man who, in 1896, was handed a problem about measuring the speed of an artillery shell in flight and answered it with polarized light. That will not come up again. I mention it only so you understand who we are dealing with.
He rose. In 1907, he was executive officer to the chief signal officer, and in that capacity was closely involved in establishing the aeronautical division of the Signal Corps, a body of, at the outset, a very small number of men, and nonetheless the first organizational ancestor of the United States Air Force. And so, in the late summer of 1908, we find him in Fort Myer in Virginia, watching the Wright brothers try to sell an aeroplane to the Army. The arrangement was a set of trials. The machine had to demonstrate certain speeds, certain endurances, and it had to be able to carry a passenger. And the passengers on several of those flights were Army officers. On the 12th of September 1908, Orville Wright took George Owen Squier up for a flight of 9 minutes and 6 seconds. He was, by the usual reckoning, only the second man to go up as a passenger at those trials, and among the earliest handful of people to have flown as a passenger at all. 5 days later, on the 17th of September, the same aircraft came down at Fort Myer, with Orville Wright at the controls and Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge as the passenger. A propeller had split. Selfridge was killed, the first person to die in the crash of a powered aeroplane, and Orville was badly injured. Squier was present in an official capacity on the board evaluating the machine. The trials resumed the following year, and the Army bought the aeroplane in 1909. Squier had, within a single fortnight, seen both the promise and the entire actuarial reality of powered flight, having gone up in the thing himself beforehand. He kept rising. He served as Chief Signal Officer of the United States Army from 1917 through the First World War, with the rank of Major General, and retired in the early 20s. He was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 1919 and collected decorations from a great many governments, none of which have any bearing on lift music whatsoever. Now, the invention. The thing Squier is genuinely important for in the history of communications is a piece of work he demonstrated in 1910, and to which he gave the arresting and slightly contradictory name wired wireless. The problem was this. A pair of telephone wires strung between two towns could, at that time, carry one conversation. One. An appalling waste of a very expensive piece of copper. Squier's insight was that you could take a second conversation, load it onto a high-frequency carrier wave, and send it down the very same wire at the same time, where it would sit above the first without disturbing it, in its own patch of the frequency spectrum, and be lifted off cleanly at the far end. Multiple carrier signals, one physical wire. This is carrier multiplexing, and it is why the 20th century could afford to have telephones in it. His own gloss was that he had put the principles of radio, transmission by frequency, inside a wire, where the signal could be kept private and kept tidy, hence wired wireless. He seems to have liked the phrase very much. And before we leave the man's inventions, we should spend a moment on the trees, because it is the single best thing about him, and because you are not going anywhere. During Army maneuvers in California, it had been noticed that field telegraph sets, useless when earthed in the bone-dry summer soil, worked perfectly well when a nail was driven into the trunk or roots of a living tree and the wire attached to that instead. Squier pursued this with complete seriousness. He experimented principally on eucalyptus with the use of growing trees as radio antennae. He published a paper called Tree Telephony and Telegraphy, and he called the apparatus the florophone. In the summer of 1919, he had a small hut in the woods outside Washington, D.C., staffed by a handful of soldiers and wired to acres of standing timber, and Scientific American sent a writer out to see it. The soldier on duty connected an oak, and there was static, and then, out of the oak, German. He went outside, connected a pine instead, and picked up Lyon, the Poldhu station in Cornwall, ships in the middle of the Atlantic,
a general of the United States Army had, in a defensible and reproducible way, made the trees talk. Hold that in your mind, a man who looked at a forest and saw a switchboard, because it explains the next part. If you can send information along a telephone wire above the conversation, you can send information along any wire. And there was, by the 1920s, one network of wire being pushed into more American buildings faster than any other: the electrical grid. The power companies were laying copper into every home and shop and hotel in the country anyway, for entirely different reasons, and that copper was, from Squier's point of view, an enormous and completely unexploited communications system somebody else had already paid for. So the patents were sold. The North American Company, a very large utility holding conglomerate, acquired the rights to Squier's signal distribution patents, among them a patent numbered 1,641,608, and in 1922 established a subsidiary to exploit them commercially. It was called, with no imagination at all, Wired Radio Incorporated. The proposition was, at the time, rather elegant. Radio receivers in the early 1920s were expensive, temperamental objects, requiring an aerial, a good deal of patience, and a willingness to be told at intervals that the atmosphere was not cooperating. Wired radio would instead pipe music into your house along the electricity supply you already had, with no aerial and no fiddling, and charge you for it on your electricity bill, a billing model so far ahead of its time that it is essentially a modern subscription. Early trials were run on Staten Island. And then, around 1934, the company was given the name it would carry for the rest of the century. The account always given, and I will note honestly that it is the account the company itself gave, which is not quite the same thing as a document, is that Squier had for years admired the trademark Kodak, a word George Eastman had simply invented that meant nothing, that belonged to nobody else and could be owned outright. Squier wanted one of those. So he took the first syllable of music, took the last two letters of Kodak, pushed them together, and the result was muzak. He did not get to see what became of it. George Owen Squier died on the 24th of March 1934 in Washington, D.C., of pneumonia, 3 days after his 69th birthday. He is buried at Arlington. Accounts place the renaming and the death within months of one another, and the order of the two is not always clearly stated. So, at this point, we have a name, a patent portfolio, a utility company's wires, and no founder. What we do not have, and what nobody at Wired Radio yet fully understood that they did not have, is a business. So the general was gone, and the company he had made possible carried on without him, which is the usual arrangement. What it carried on with was a plan. The plan was this: music would travel down the electrical wiring already threaded through the walls of an ordinary house, arrive at a small receiving box in the parlor, and be paid for as a line on the electricity bill, the way you might pay for the electricity itself. No aerial, no tuning, no static drifting in from the weather. A steady, clean, contracted supply of music, delivered like water. It is worth pausing on how sensible that sounded in 1934. Radio in the early 1930s was not the smooth thing it later became. Reception wandered, sets required patience. The signal in a valley or behind a hill was a matter of luck and local geography. Against that, a wire is a wire. A wire does not care about the weather.
If you had spent your career, as Squier had, thinking about the physics of sending signals through solid infrastructure rather than through open air, the household subscription looked less like a gamble than like an obvious tidying up of a messy situation. The service went into homes in Cleveland, Ohio. Subscribers paid $1.50 a month and received 3 channels, which carried, depending on the hour, dance music, other lighter music, and news. There were also commercials and announcements, because nobody in 1934 had yet arrived at the idea that the absence of a voice might itself be the product. You do not need to remember the $1.50. It is simply useful to know that a real number existed, that real households in a real Ohio neighborhood signed real agreements, and that somewhere there were engineers checking whether the music was arriving cleanly at the far end of the street. It did not work. It did not work quite quickly, in fact, in the way that business ideas sometimes fail, not through catastrophe, but through a slow, embarrassing arithmetic. The problem was never technical. The problem was that radio was free. A household could buy a set once and then receive music, news, comedy, drama, and religion for the rest of the set's natural life without ever paying another cent to anybody. And radio in those years was not standing still. It was consolidating into networks, buying better talent, improving its transmitters. Every month that passed made the case for paying $1.50 a little weaker. There is no clever countermove available to a company selling a paid version of a thing that is improving and free. Before 1934 was over, the leadership had accepted this and turned the business round to face somewhere else entirely. 2 changes followed, one of which sounds like a footnote and is not. The first was that the music left the power lines and went on to telephone lines instead, because telephone lines were easier and cheaper to work with. This meant that within a couple of years of the company acquiring its name, the actual invention on which the whole enterprise had been founded, the sending of signals along electrical cables, had been quietly set aside as the less practical option. The name stayed. The patents stayed in the drawer. The music went down the phone wires. Nobody made a fuss about it. The second change was that the company stopped trying to sell to people in their homes and started selling to people who owned buildings. Hotels first, and restaurants in New York City. Later, and this is where the whole thing eventually goes, offices. Around this, the ownership of the business began to move about in the manner of a parcel at a children's party. It had begun under the North American Company, a large electrical utility holding concern, which is a perfectly logical parent for a business about wires. Then, in the late 1930s, the film studio Warner Brothers bought it, along with the music publishing assets that came with it. Accounts differ on the year. You will see 1937 and you will see 1938, and the difference does not much matter, because Warner Brothers held it for roughly 12 months and then let it go again. In 1939, it was sold to 3 men, Waddill Catchings, Alan Miller, and William Benton. By 1941, Benton had bought out the other 2 for a figure usually reported as $100,000, and the company was his. We are going to spend a while on William Benton, because he is exactly the sort of man who ends up owning the elevator music company, and because you are going nowhere. Benton was born in Minneapolis on the 1st of April, 1900. He went into advertising in the early 20s, and in 1929, which was not an obviously wonderful year to start a business, he founded the New York agency Benton and Bowles with his friend Chester Bowles. The agency succeeded during the Depression, which is a genuinely difficult trick. and Benton walked away from it in 1935, in his mid-30s, wealthy and, by all accounts, finished with advertising as a daily occupation. From 1937 to 1945, he was a part-time vice president of the University of Chicago. In 1939, he bought a company that piped music into hotels.
And then the rest of it happens. In 1943, he became the publisher and chairman of Encyclopaedia Britannica, a position he held until his death. And in the same year, he set in motion the great books of the Western world, engaging Mortimer Adler and Robert Hutchins to edit it, a project that eventually appeared in 1952 in 52 volumes. From the 31st of August 1945 to the 30th of September 1947, he was the United States Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs. On the 17th of December 1949, he was appointed to a vacant United States Senate seat for Connecticut by the governor of Connecticut, who was Chester Bowles, his old advertising partner, which is the kind of detail that would seem too neat if it were invented. He then won the seat properly in a special election on the 7th of November 1950, defeating a Republican named Prescott Bush by 1,102 votes. He served until January 1953 and lost the seat at the next attempt. In 1951, he introduced a resolution to expel Senator Joseph McCarthy from the Senate and submitted some 30,000 words of testimony in support of it in the September of that year. The Senate looked into the matter at length and punished nobody. Later, he was ambassador to UNESCO in Paris from 1963 to 1968. He died in March 1973, aged 72. So, an advertising man, a university vice president, an encyclopedia publisher, a senator, an ambassador, a man who tried to remove Joseph McCarthy from the United States Senate and failed, and throughout a good deal of it, the proprietor of the background music. Hold those in the same head at the same time. They belong to one person. Under Benton, the business found the idea that made it what it became, and the idea is a very simple one, and it is worth sitting with quietly. The customer was not the listener. The customer had never been the listener. The person who paid was the man who owned the hotel, or the restaurant, or the factory, or eventually the lift. The person who heard the music had not chosen it, could not change it, could not turn it off, was not consulted, and did not pay. In the trade's own language, the person hearing it was not an audience at all. A muzak vice president, Donald O'Neill, is quoted as having put it that this was a sound form one was meant to hear and not to listen to. And while the phrasing varies between tellings, the distinction is exact and deliberate. Listening is something you do. Hearing is something that happens to you. The entire commercial proposition sat in the gap between those two verbs.
Once you accept that, the questions change. You stop asking whether the music is good, because good is a judgment made by an audience, and there is no audience. You start asking what the music does to the room, and to the people standing in the room, and whether that effect can be sold to the person who owns the room. That is a different discipline altogether. It is closer to lighting design or ventilation. Then came the war, and the war made the argument for them. From 1940 onwards, the factories filled up, shifts lengthened, the work became more repetitive, and a great deal of it was being done by people who had never done factory work before. Thousands of American factories, arsenals, and shipyards were wired for music during those years, and the figure that the company would repeat for decades afterwards was that production at those facilities rose by around 11%. Britain arrived at the same conclusion by its own route. The BBC began broadcasting Music While You Work on the 23rd of June 1940 at the government's request, half an hour in the morning and half an hour in the afternoon, deliberately even in tempo, deliberately unremarkable. British factory reports of the period claim substantial gains in output, and one plant is said to have had to withdraw deep in the heart of Texas because the workers kept stopping to clap along with the music, which suggests, if nothing else, that the tempo people were not being paranoid. Whether 11% is a real number, or a wartime number, or an advertising number, is a question we will come back to. What matters is that the company now had something no music business had ever had before, a claim that its product did measurable work, not that it was enjoyed, that it functioned. And a company that believes its music performs a measurable industrial function will, sooner or later, hire someone to work out precisely how, and will give the result a name. The name, when it came, was stimulus progression, and it is worth saying at the outset that this was not a metaphor and not a slogan invented afterwards by an advertising department. It was a programming method. It had rules. It had a catalogue underneath it, and in that catalogue, every piece of music the company owned had been converted into a number. For something in the region of 30 years, that method governed what came out of the ceiling in a very large number of American rooms. We will spend a while here. You are not going anywhere. Begin with the shape of it, because the shape is the whole idea, and everything else is machinery in service of the shape. Muzak did not program its music as a continuous stream. It programmed in quarter hours. 15 minutes was the unit, and within any one of those 15 minutes there would be something like 6 selections, one after another, arranged in a deliberate order. That order was not random, and it was not aesthetic. The selections ascended. The first piece in the quarter hour was the least stimulating piece in the quarter hour, and each piece after it was slightly more stimulating than the one before, and the last piece was the most stimulating of the 6. Then the quarter hour ended. And here is the part that people tend to get wrong when they describe it, so we will go slowly. When the quarter hour ended, the next one did not continue the climb. It dropped. It began again from somewhere low and climbed again to somewhere high and then dropped again. The working day was not a ramp. It was a series of small ascents with a fall at the end of each one, over and over, from the morning through to the evening. If you were to draw it on paper, you would get a row of teeth or the edge of a saw, and this was intentional. The theory held that what a worker responded to was not stimulation itself, but the sensation of increasing stimulation, the feeling of being carried very gently forward. To keep supplying that sensation, you have to keep resetting the floor you are climbing from. So the company reset it 4 times an hour, all day, in every building it served. There is a second element to the shape, and it is the element that most people, on hearing it, find the strangest, which is the silence. The standard practice was 15 minutes of music, followed by 15 minutes of nothing. Half the working day in a building wired for muzak was not muzak. It was an empty ceiling. Now, some of that was practical. There were technical and mechanical reasons why a system of that era did not necessarily want to run continuously. But the company also had a rationale for it, and the rationale is the interesting part. Their position, supported by research the company itself paid for, was that music which never stopped would stop working. The listener would habituate. The ear would file it under permanent conditions, along with the ventilation and the strip lighting and the distant sound of the lift, and once it had been filed there, it could no longer lift anybody. The silence was not a gap in the product. The silence was part of the product. It was there to make the music continue to count as an event. You were being rested so that you could be stimulated again, which is a slightly remarkable thing to have engineered into the fabric of an office, and nobody in that office was told about it. Now to the catalogue, because to arrange 6 recordings in ascending order of stimulation, you must first have decided how much stimulation each recording contains, and that decision had to be made in advance, once, for every recording the company held. So each piece was assigned a value. The common description of the system is a scale of 1 to 6, a mood rating, sometimes called a stimulus value, where a 1 is slow and subdued, and a 6 is bright and driving, and a 2 is straightforwardly less invigorating than a 5 in the way that 2 is less than 5. The value was not arrived at by intuition, or at least it was not presented as intuition. It was derived from a set of stated factors: tempo, obviously, rhythm, the firmness and regularity of it, instrumentation, meaning which families of instruments carry the piece, strings and woodwinds sitting lower on the scale than brass, the size of the ensemble, a larger orchestra reading as more stimulating than a smaller one, and the general mood or brightness of the arrangement, described in the company's own materials on a range running roughly from gloomy at one end to something like ecstatic at the other. To these were added the surrounding decisions, sequencing, timing, and volume. Sit with what that means for a moment. A piece of music goes in one end of the process as a performance with a composer and an arranger and a room full of players and whatever it is that a piece of music has, and it comes out the other end as an integer, not a description, not a review, an integer next to a title in a list. And once it is an integer, it can be sorted, and once it can be sorted, it can be scheduled. And once it can be scheduled, a man in an office who has never heard it can place it third in a quarter hour at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday in a factory 1,100 miles away for reasons that have nothing whatever to do with the music and everything to do with the number. You do not need to remember any of this, but it is, I think, the moment at which the whole enterprise becomes something other than a music business. Because the schedule was aimed. The quarter hours were not merely ascending. The overall level of the ascending quarter hours was itself raised at particular hours of the day, and those hours were chosen against a curve. The curve was the human fatigue curve, a concept that industrial physiologists had been taking seriously since the late 19th century, and which holds, in its simplest form, that alertness across a working day is not flat and does not simply decline, but sags twice, once in the late morning, once in the middle of the afternoon. Those two troughs were the targets. The company's own patent language describes a process of programming music at faster tempos precisely to counteract the tendency of the human mind and body to slow down during the late morning and the mid-afternoon. So the music got a little brighter, a little brisker, a little more brass in it at the two moments in the day when a person is most likely to be staring at a wall. Two peaks engineered every day in thousands of buildings, arriving on time whether anybody in the building was tired or not. What was claimed for all of this was substantial. Productivity would rise, absenteeism would fall, errors would fall. Figures circulated.
a productivity improvement of around 9%, and a reduction in typing errors of something close to 39%, though the sourcing there is thin and the exact decimal drifts depending on which retelling you are reading, which is usually a sign that a number has been passed along more often than it has been checked. There was genuine research in the background. Work associated with Harold Burris Meyer and Richard Cardinal in the middle of the century pointed toward reduced brass and reduced vocals and an emphasis on strings and woodwinds as the more effective formula for an industrial setting.
But it is only honest to say plainly that the independent evidence never really matched the confidence of the sales material. A great deal of the research was commissioned by the company itself, which does not make it false, but does mean it was not disinterested. The trials of the period had the ordinary weaknesses of the period: modest sample sizes, uncontrolled conditions, and above all the difficulty that a factory which has just installed a new system and been told it will improve output is a factory whose output may improve for reasons entirely unconnected to what is coming out of the speakers. Later work found effects that were smaller or inconsistent or dependent on the task and the person to a degree that a single ascending curve could never accommodate. Some found no effect. Some found background music actively worse than quiet. None of that means the whole thing was a fraud. The company appears to have believed its own method. It means only that a very confident industrial claim was resting on a much softer floor than anybody buying it was invited to notice, and that we should describe the claim as a claim. Which brings us to the last piece of the engineering, and the one that I would ask you to hold on to if you hold on to anything, which is that muzak did not simply buy records and play them. It re-recorded. It commissioned its own arrangements, made by its own musicians, of material it could otherwise have licensed as it stood. And it did this because the existing recordings were unusable, not because they were bad, but because they were good. A hit record is built to seize you. That is its entire function. It has a voice in it, and the human ear will follow a human voice out of any texture it is buried in. It has a hook engineered to lodge. It has dynamics, quiet passages and loud ones, and a change in volume is one of the oldest alarms the nervous system has. It has a solo, a moment where one player steps forward and asks to be noticed. Every one of those features is a device for capturing attention, and for muzak, every one of them was a defect, so they were removed. The vocals went first and were replaced by an instrument carrying the line, a piano, a guitar, a woodwind. The solos went. The dynamic extremes were flattened, compressed into a narrow band, so that nothing ever swelled and nothing ever dropped away. Anything with an edge on it was sanded off. The company's working rules ran against minor keys, against anything too long, against any moment that stood up out of the surface. What is left when you have removed all of that is a very strange object, and it took the removal of a great many things to arrive at it. It is music that has been arranged, orchestrated, rehearsed, performed by professionals, recorded, mastered, and distributed at real expense, with the specific and stated design goal that no one should ever listen to it. Not that it should be liked, not that it should be ignored by accident, that it should be by construction unlistenable to. Present in the room, doing work on the people in the room, and incapable of being brought into focus by any of them. And yet, nobody calls it office music. Nobody calls it factory music, or lobby music, or waiting room music, though those are the rooms where the great majority of it was actually heard, and where the great majority of the company's money was actually made. It is called elevator music. The name attached itself somewhere in the middle of the century, and it never came off. and it is worth spending some time on it, because the answer is better than you would expect. It is not a joke about small rooms. It is a genuine piece of architectural and psychological history, and it begins with the problem of getting people up tall buildings. A building can only be as tall as people are willing to climb. That is the whole constraint, and for most of human history it held. Somewhere around 6 or 7 stories, the upper floors stop being valuable and start being storage, because nobody wants to walk up to them, and the rent falls the higher you go. The hoist existed. Hoists had existed for centuries. The problem with a hoist was that it was attached to a rope, and ropes break, and when the rope broke, the platform and everything on it went to the bottom of the shaft. This was tolerable for flour sacks. It was not tolerable for a bank manager. The man usually credited with solving this is Elisha Graves Otis, and the solution was not the elevator, which already existed, but the brake. Otis devised a safety mechanism using a wagon spring, arranged so that the tension of the hoisting rope held it compressed. Cut the rope and the spring released, and its ends sprang outward into the toothed guide rails on either side of the shaft, and the platform stopped. The device was simple in the way that only extremely good ideas are simple. The difficulty was that nobody believed it. So, in the spring of 1854, at the Crystal Palace, on the site of what is now Bryant Park in New York, at the Exhibition of the Industry of All Nations, accounts differ slightly on the year, since the exhibition had opened the previous summer and 1853 is sometimes given, but 1854 is the date generally settled on. Otis stood on an open platform and had himself hoisted above a crowd. He was wearing a top hat. The story is told, and it is told consistently enough to be worth repeating, though the detail is hard to source firmly, that P.T. Barnum paid him $100 to do it. An assistant cut the hoisting rope with an axe. The platform dropped a few inches and stopped. Otis, still in the hat, is supposed to have said, "All safe, gentlemen, all safe." 3 years later, in 1857, Otis installed his first passenger elevator in the E.V. Hoffaut building on Broadway, a 5-story emporium selling cut glass and porcelain. From there, the sums reverse. The top floor becomes the best floor. The penthouse is invented. The skyline of the 20th century is, in a fairly direct sense, a consequence of a spring that catches. You do not need to remember any of this. But an elevator, for its 90 years or so, contained a person. Not just passengers, a staff member in a uniform with a lever and a stool, who knew the building and the floors and the tenants, who announced the departments in shops, who was in charge. You were not sealed in a box. You were in a small room with an employee, and the employee was responsible. And this is a psychologically enormous difference that nobody thought about very much until the employees stopped coming to work. In September 1945, weeks after the end of the war, some 15,000 elevator operators, doormen, porters and building maintenance workers went on strike across commercial buildings in New York City. The effect was immediate and total. Office towers cannot function without vertical transport. Contemporary accounts put the number of office workers unable to reach their desks at around 1.5 million, and the cost to the city in the region of $100 million. And while both of those figures come to us softened by retelling, the scale is not in dispute. The city had built itself upward on the assumption of a man with a lever, and the man with the lever had withdrawn his labor. The industry drew the obvious conclusion. The technology, in fact, was already there. Push-button automatic elevators had been demonstrated as far back as the 1890s and had failed commercially for one reason, which was that passengers would not touch the buttons. Otis introduced its autotronic system in 1948, and the first installation was completed in 1950 in the Atlantic Refining Building in Dallas, an 11-story block since demolished, generally described as the first building in the world with high-speed group-controlled elevators and no operators at all. And then came the difficult part, which was persuading the public to get in. What followed was one of the more sustained reassurance campaigns in the history of commercial technology. There were advertisements showing children and elderly passengers operating elevators, the point being that if they could manage it, so could you. There was the emergency stop button, at least as much a psychological device as a mechanical one, since its primary function is to be visible. There was the emergency telephone. In many installations, there was a recorded voice, a calm one, telling you which floor you had arrived at, so that the box would speak to you the way the operator used to. And there was music. That is the honest origin of the phrase. Not that Muzak's business was elevators, it emphatically was not, but an automatic elevator was a novel and slightly frightening object, and background music was among the things installed to make an enclosed, windowless moving room feel less like a sealed container and more like an interior. There is a widely repeated story that Muzak and the Otis Elevator Company took out joint advertising in the late 1940s promoting exactly this, and it may well be true, though I have not been able to trace it to anything solid, so we will leave it where it sits. What the company genuinely did have was everywhere else. Through the 1950s and 60s, Muzak spread into the entire built environment of institutional life. Factory floors, open-plan offices, department stores, supermarkets, hotel lobbies, restaurants, bank branches, dentists' waiting rooms, hospital corridors, and government buildings. It is documented that the White House was wired for Muzak in 1953 under Eisenhower, playing in the background in the West Wing, and it is also documented, pleasingly, that Lyndon Johnson owned the Muzak franchise in Austin, Texas. It is frequently said that it played in the Pentagon, and I am inclined to believe it given how much else it was in, but that particular claim circulates in a slightly soft form, and I will not present it as firmer than it is.
Which brings us to space, where we must be careful, because this is the point at which the story usually loses its footing. You will read in a great many places that NASA piped Muzak into the Apollo 11 capsule to soothe the astronauts during launch. It is a lovely image. It is repeated confidently and constantly. It is also, as far as I have been able to establish, unsighted. Every telling traces back to another telling, and behind them all sits the company's own promotional material, which had an obvious interest in the association. So we will not assert it. What is documented is quieter and, I think, nicer. Beginning with Apollo 9 in 1969, each astronaut was issued a small tape recorder intended for logging observations with a built-in speaker. The crews used them for music. They made mixtapes. Buzz Aldrin took Barbra Streisand and Lou Rawls. The Apollo 12 crew had Sugar Sugar by the Archies. Ron Evans on Apollo 17 brought a recording of Christmas carols sung by his neighbors. And because the mission logs had to be recorded over the same tape, the music was gradually erased as the flight went on, so that the longer the astronauts were away from Earth, the less music they had left. That is real, and it is documented, and it required no corporation at all. The scale, meanwhile, on the ground was extraordinary. By the late 1950s, the company was claiming that its programming reached something in the order of 50 million Americans every day. By the early 1980s, the figure being given was around 80 million daily listeners, with the service syndicated in 19 countries. These are company figures and should be held loosely, the way you hold any number a business publishes about itself, but even discounted heavily, they describe something without much precedent. For a period of perhaps 30 years, this was, by a straightforward count of ears, the most heard music on the planet. And it was, by design, the least listened to music on the planet. Those are not intention. That was the product. The entire engineering effort described earlier, the flattened arrangements, the removed solos, the 15-minute blocks, the silence, existed to guarantee that of the 80 million people hearing it, as close as possible to none of them would be listening. It was manufactured to be received and not attended to, and it succeeded so completely that its own audience could not have told you what they had spent the day hearing. There is one more thread worth pulling here, and it is the physical one, because all of that had to arrive somewhere by some means. It began, as we have covered, with wires. Squier's whole premise was music down the electrical line. For decades, the workhorse was the leased telephone line, a dedicated circuit, rented by the month, from a local music franchise office to a subscriber's premises, carrying nothing but background music, permanently. Then came the air. Under rules the Federal Communications Commission settled in 1955, FM stations could carry a subsidiary signal alongside their ordinary broadcast, a subcarrier, riding on the same channel, inaudible on a normal receiver, decodable only by a special set installed on the subscriber's wall. Music became the largest single user of those subcarriers in the country. So for years, there was a second silent layer of music traveling through the same air as the radio you were listening to, arriving in rooms you were not in. And later still, it went to satellite, up to geostationary orbit and back down, 22,000 miles, for a string arrangement nobody was going to hear. It would be easy, at this distance, to assume that people simply tolerated all of this, that the music arrived in the lobbies and the lifts and the waiting rooms and the supermarket aisles, and the public, having no particular opinion about it, allowed it to become part of the furniture of ordinary life. That is not what happened. What happened is that a great many people hated it, and went on hating it, with a steadiness and a formality of expression that is genuinely surprising to encounter now. They wrote letters, they formed societies, they introduced bills in national legislatures, they took the matter to the highest court of the United States. This was never a fringe irritation of the sort that produces a grumble and then subsides. It was a sustained civic argument conducted in public over several decades about whether a person walking through a shared space has any enforceable interest in the sound that reaches their ears. And nobody ever really settled it. The argument simply ran out of institutional energy, which is a different thing. We should spend some time on the court case because it is the point at which the objection stopped being a matter of taste and became briefly a matter of constitutional law. Toward the end of the 1940s, the Capital Transit Company, which ran the streetcars and buses of Washington, District of Columbia, began fitting its vehicles with radio receivers. The programming came from a local FM station and consisted, by the accounting later placed before the courts, of roughly 90% music, 5% announcements, and 5% commercial advertising. Capital Transit conducted rider surveys, found that most passengers said they did not mind, and made the arrangement permanent. The Public Utilities Commission of the District of Columbia investigated and concluded that the broadcasts were not inconsistent with public convenience, comfort, and safety, which was the standard it was obliged to apply. Two passengers disagreed. One of them was Franklin S. Pollock. The other was a man named Martin.
and the case travelled through the system under both their names before settling, as these things do, on the shorter one. Their argument was not that the music was bad. It was that they were riding a vehicle they had no realistic alternative to riding, operated under a government-granted franchise and regulated by a government commission, and that being made to listen to programming chosen by somebody else for somebody else's commercial purposes was a deprivation of liberty. The Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia agreed with them. It held that the broadcasts deprived objecting passengers of liberty without due process of law. This is worth pausing on because it means that for a period in the early 1950s in the capital of the United States, background music on public transport was unlawful. The Supreme Court reversed. The case is Public Utilities Commission of the District of Columbia against Pollock, argued in March of 1952 and decided on the 26th of May that year. Justice Burton wrote for the majority. The reasoning was, in essence, that the music and the occasional advertisement did not amount to an interference with the constitutional rights of passengers sufficient to be actionable, and that the objecting passengers, however sincerely they felt what they felt, had not identified a right the Constitution protected. 6 justices joined that opinion. 1 more concurred separately, 1 dissented, and 1 did not take part at all, for a reason we will come to in a moment, because it is the most human thing in the entire record. The dissent was written by Justice William O. Douglas, and it is the reason anybody remembers the case. Douglas did not treat the question as a small one. He located the objection in privacy, and he stated the principle in a sentence that has outlived every other sentence in the decision. "The right to be let alone," he wrote, "is indeed the beginning of all freedom." He then made the argument that has been borrowed ever since by everyone who has ever wanted to be left in peace in a public place. A man can walk out of a restaurant. A man can switch off the wireless in his own sitting room. But the streetcar audience, Douglas wrote, is a captive audience. It is there as a matter of necessity, not of choice. That is the whole of it, really. Nobody was objecting to the music as music. The objection was to the absence of a door. Justice Felix Frankfurter took no part in the consideration or decision of the case, and filed a short memorandum explaining why. He had, he said, feelings so strongly engaged as a victim of the practice in controversy that he had better not participate in judicial judgment upon it. He went on to observe that reason cannot control the influence of feelings of which it is unaware, and that when there is ground for believing such feelings may operate, judges recuse themselves. It is, on its face, an unremarkable piece of judicial hygiene. It is also a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States formally declaring, in the official reports, that he disliked the music on the bus too much to be trusted with the question. You do not need to remember any of this, but it is there in volume 343 if you ever want it. The organized opposition outlasted the litigation by a very long way. In Britain, the most durable of these efforts is Pipe Down, the campaign for freedom from piped music, founded in 1992 by the author Nigel Rogers, who, by his own account, had reached the end of his patience in a restaurant. The campaign's definition of the thing it opposes is admirably precise. Music piped without pause through a room or building where people have gone for reasons other than to listen to it. Its methods were the methods of the letter-writing age. Members were supplied with small printed cards to leave behind in pubs and shops, explaining why they would not be returning. In 1994, a survey of 68,077 people at Gatwick Airport found that 43% disliked the piped music, and the airport removed it from the main areas. Waterstones and Sainsbury's made concessions. Marks and Spencer stopped piping music through its stores in 2016. In 2000, Robert Key, the Member of Parliament for Salisbury, introduced legislation to restrict recorded music in public places with particular attention to hospitals. In 2006, Lord Beaumont introduced a similar bill, which passed the House of Lords and then stopped, as such bills generally do, somewhere in the Commons. Along the way, the campaign accumulated a supporters list suggesting the objection was concentrated in a particular kind of ear: the pianist Alfred Brendel, the conductor Simon Rattle, the cellist Julian Lloyd Webber, the novelist Philip Pullman, and the actor Joanna Lumley. Which brings us to the musicians, who were rarely neutral, and to the single most interesting thing anyone ever did in response to muzak, which was not to campaign against it, but to build a rival to it. Brian Eno, by his own telling, arrived at the idea while stranded at Cologne-Bonn Airport in Germany in the middle 1970s, contemplating a large glass building full of anxious people and a sound environment that seemed to have been designed by someone who had never been anxious in their life. The record that resulted, Ambient 1, Music for Airports, appeared at the turn of 1978 into 1979, and on its sleeve Eno set out what he meant by the word ambient in terms that are explicitly and rather coolly a rebuke. Conventional background music, he wrote, is produced by stripping away all sense of doubt and uncertainty from the music, whereas ambient music retains those qualities. Their intention, he said, meaning the intention of the background music industry, is to brighten the environment by adding stimulus to it, supposedly relieving the tedium of routine tasks and leveling out the natural rises and falls of the body's rhythms. Ambient music, by contrast, is intended to induce calm and a space to think. And then the formulation that has been quoted more or less continuously ever since, that such music must be able to accommodate many levels of listening attention without enforcing any one of them in particular, and must be as ignorable as it is interesting. Sit with that phrase for a moment, because it is doing more than it appears to. As ignorable as it is interesting is not a rejection of background music. It is a rejection of a specific theory of background music. Muzak's project, as we have already spent some time establishing, was to remove from a recording every feature that might catch a listener and hold them: the unexpected interval, the vocal, the solo, the change of dynamic, the pause that means something. What is left after that removal is not neutral, it is smoothed. Eno's proposition was that you could make music a person was entirely free to ignore, which was nevertheless still music, still containing doubt and uncertainty, still rewarding attention, if attention happened to arrive. There is an epilogue which the people who love the record generally leave out. Music for Airports was actually installed in an airport, at the Marine Air Terminal at LaGuardia in New York for a period in the early 1980s. It did not go well. Travelers and staff reported that it induced unease and that it sounded, in a phrase that has followed the record around for 40 years, like funeral music. The terminal returned to more conventional sound. It is possible to draw a moral from this, and it is possible not to. We are not going to. Other musicians were less philosophical and more direct. The story is very widely told, and told with great confidence, that in 1986 the guitarist Ted Nugent made an offer of $10 million for muzak with the stated purpose of shutting it down, and that the offer was declined. It appears in reputable places. It is also, so far as one can establish, always the same story, repeated without an original source, and the more one looks for the document underneath it, the less there is to find. So we will leave it where it belongs, in the category of things that are probably true and are certainly repeated, and move on. The final indignity, and in some ways the largest, was linguistic. The word muzak was a trademark. It had been registered, it was owned, and it was defended in the ordinary way that corporate marks are defended. And it was eaten alive by its own reputation. At some point, the word slipped its moorings, lost its capital letter, and became a common noun, meaning any bland, unwanted music playing anywhere at all, usually with the implication that whoever chose it was not really listening either. It went into the dictionaries in that form. It is still there. If you call something muzak today, you are not naming a supplier, you are delivering a verdict. And the verdict is that the thing in question has had everything interesting removed from it on purpose. A company that had spent half a century engineering music nobody would notice ended up with a brand name everybody knew, and knew as an insult. The end of it, when it came, did not come the way endings are supposed to come. There was no collapse. Nobody in a corner office switched off a transmitter one gray afternoon and let the lobbies of America fall silent. There was no scandal, no ruinous verdict, no single day that anyone remembers. What happened instead was slower and much stranger than that. The company gradually, deliberately, and with every appearance of sound commercial judgment, stopped doing the thing it had invented. The pressure came from below, as it usually does. Through the early 1980s, muzak found itself losing ground to a set of smaller competitors, AEI Music Network among them, and a company called Yesco, who was selling businesses something muzak had spent half a century declining to sell them. They were selling the actual records, not orchestras hired to play a careful, smoothed, functional version of a song, but the song itself by the people who had made it, licensed and piped into the shop exactly as it existed on the radio. The industry gave this a name, and the name was foreground music, which tells you everything about what it was meant to do. It was not designed to be unnoticed, it was designed to be liked. Muzak, faced with this, did the sensible thing, which was to give in. In 1984, it struck a deal with Yesco to supply music to its own customers. In 1985, it launched a service of its own, called, without ceremony, Foreground Music One. At the very end of 1986, the two companies merged outright. The following year, a new vice president of programming, Bruce Funkhauser, replaced Rod Baum, and the direction of travel became unmistakable. By 1988, the company was pushing out multiple specialized satellite channels of popular music, and over the decade that followed, the old instrumental catalog was quietly retired, channel by channel, until by around 1997, the original artists were playing on essentially everything. Essentially. The accounts differ a little on the precise end of it, and it is worth being honest about that, because there was one holdout, a channel called Environmental, which carried the old sound, the arranged and re-recorded and carefully unremarkable sound, for years after the rest of the company had moved on. Somewhere in the schedule, long after the world had stopped wanting it, the original thing was still going out to whoever still wanted it. Nobody seems to have written down the day it stopped. which leaves the fact that sits at the center of all this, and it is a fact that has to be stated plainly, because dressing it up would be doing it a disservice. The elevator music company stopped making elevator music. The corporation that had spent decades measuring the stimulus value of a trombone, that had built a science of not being listened to, that had made its entire fortune out of the proposition that music should be manufactured specifically in order to be ignored, that corporation looked at its market and concluded that people would prefer to hear the real song. And it was right. It kept trading for another quarter of a century. But the thing that had made it muzak was gone by then, sold off in pieces to its own customers' preferences, and what remained was a competent distributor of other people's records. The corporate life that followed has the texture of an estate being settled. The company had been based in Seattle since 1986, and in 1999 it announced it was leaving. A new headquarters of 100,000 square feet to be built at Fort Myer, South Carolina, just over the state line from Charlotte, with something like 200 Seattle employees offered the chance to follow it south. The move completed around the turn of the millennium. There, in South Carolina, the company rebranded what it did. It no longer sold background music. It sold audio architecture, the designing of custom sonic environments for individual clients, a phrase which is both entirely accurate as a description of the work and quietly magnificent as an act of corporate self-regard.
The debts, however, had followed it from Seattle. On the 10th of February 2009, Muzak Holdings filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It emerged the following January, in 2010, with a court-approved plan that cut its debt by more than half. It was, by then, still a substantial business, around $195 million of revenue in its final full year of independence, and in March of 2011, a Canadian company called Mood Media agreed to buy it. The deal closed on the 6th of May that year for $345 million, including debt repaid at closing, and it produced a combined operation serving something in the region of 470,000 commercial premises across more than 39 countries. And then, on the 5th of February 2013, Mood Media announced that it would be retiring the name. Not the service, not the wiring, not the contracts, not the 470,000 rooms, just the word. Accounts vary as to how long the actual disappearance took. Some place the last of it nearer 2015, and probably it faded off invoices and vans and lobby plaques at whatever pace such things fade. But the announcement was made, and the 8 decades that had begun with a retired major general wiring music down electrical cables in Cleveland came to a close with a press release about brand consolidation.
It would be easy to file this as a failure, and it would be wrong. Muzak did not lose. Muzak won so completely that there was no longer any reason for it to exist as a separate thing. Consider what it actually proposed, that music could be manufactured as a functional product rather than an artistic one, that its purpose could be the modification of behavior and mood in a room, measured and scheduled and delivered on a timetable, that the listener need not be listening, and indeed had better not be, because the effect works best when the attention is elsewhere. Every one of those propositions is now simply true, everywhere, all the time, and nobody argues about it. The playlists assembled by algorithm for the specific hours of your day, the streaming channels named not for a genre or an artist, but for a task, focus, chill, deep work, study, sleep. The lo-fi loops running in the corner of a laptop for 11 hours at a stretch while somebody does their accounts. All of it is functional music. All of it is engineered against attention that is deliberately being spent on something else. There is no building you can enter and no device you can open that does not offer it to you. The company is born, and its idea is the water. That is the whole of it, and it does not need embellishing. There is a small coda, which is that the sound itself was eventually retrieved by people who had never worked in an office with it. In the early 2010s, an internet microgenre called vaporwave assembled itself largely out of slowed and stretched fragments of exactly this material: smooth jazz, corporate background music, the easy listening residue of shopping centers and hold queues, treating it not as filler but as artifact, an accidental record of a particular kind of room that no longer exists. Which means the least memorable music ever produced is now, in certain quarters, collectible. It was made to be forgotten, and it was not forgotten, and there is no lesson in that, only the fact of it. So, it is late, and the offices are empty, which is the condition they were always secretly designed for. Think of the buildings tonight, not the busy ones, the other ones. The tower with the cleaning trolley on the 9th floor and nobody behind it just at the moment. The lobby with the polished stone and the unmanned desk and the 2 chairs nobody has ever sat in. The lift stopped somewhere in the middle of the shaft, doors closed, lit, waiting for a call it will not get until the morning. In a great many of these rooms right now, there is music playing, quietly, at a level nobody chose deliberately, out of a speaker in a ceiling tile that has not been looked at in years. There is the corridor of a hotel on its 4th floor at 2:30, with the carpet pattern running away in both directions and every door shut. There is the multi-story car park with 11 cars left in it and the ramp lights on. There is the shopping center with the shutters down and the fountain switched off, and the escalators standing still, and the benches in the middle of it all arranged very neatly around nothing. And there is nobody in any of it to hear. The music does not know that. It plays through the empty lobby exactly as it plays through the full one, holding the room at the temperature it was set to, softening the corners of a space that contains nothing that needs softening. It will do this all night. It will still be doing it at 4 in the morning, when the cleaners have gone and the security screens cycle through their grey, unpeopled views, and at 5 and at 6, and it will still be doing it when the first person pushes through the revolving door with a coffee and does not notice that anything has been happening at all. Which was always the point. It was never for you. It was for the room, and the room is fine, and the room will be fine. So let the lifts sit where they are. Let the lobbies be empty, and the ceiling speakers be warm, and the strings go up and go down and go up again in the dark to nobody in 100,000 buildings at once, patient and unhurried and entirely unbothered by the absence of an audience. It was engineered not to be listened to. Tonight, it has finally got its wish. Sleep well, and when you next find yourself wanting to forget, just for an hour, everything that actually matters, the useless hour will be waiting. Good night.